Have you ever heard of a mother who was only 13 years old, not in some distant village, not in a tale of poverty or misfortune, but right at the heart of England's most brutal game of power, where thrones were won with blood and loyalty was bought with betrayal? That girl wasn't chosen. She was used. A forced marriage, a stranger for a husband, a belly swelling with child while she was still playing with dolls. And then, a cold night. The pain came before they could even summon the midwife. She gave birth alone as horses thundered past outside, and the clashing of swords echoed through stone halls. Her son born in blood, in fear, in silence. They thought she would die. They hoped she would. But she didn't die. She vanished, then returned, stronger, colder. And when she came back, the very men who dismissed her were kneeling before the boy they once scorned. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the rise of a mind sharpened by pain and tempered by vengeance. If you're drawn to stories that history tried to bury, if you want to meet the silent hands that toppled kingdoms from behind velvet curtains, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story is just getting started. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and her son would become king. England in the mid-15th century wasn't a kingdom. It was a wound that never stopped bleeding. The royal court was divided by greed and hatred. Thrones didn't last long beneath a single ruler. Every few years a new king emerged, and with each new king, hundreds of bodies filled the rivers and ditches. This was the era of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal decades-long civil war between two royal houses, Lancaster and York. Both claimed descent from the crown. Both believed they had the divine right to rule. And they didn't argue with words. They argued with swords, with betrayal, with executions. In the ashes of that chaos, Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443. She was noble-born, descended from Edward III, tied by blood to the House of Lancaster. But Margaret wasn't born with a crown in her crib. She was born into whispers. Is this child a pawn? Or a queen, in waiting her father died before she could speak his name? Her mother was pushed aside, and Margaret, still a toddler, was handed over like property, bartered through marriages meant to gain land loyalty and leverage. At age 12, Margaret was married off to Edmund Tudor half-brother to King Henry VI. This wasn't a love match. It was a political calculation. The Lancastrians knew that if Margaret with her royal blood bore a child with a Tudor, that child could have one of the strongest claims to the throne. And that child did come, but at a staggering cost. Edmund died before the child was born, captured and imprisoned by the Yorkists, dead from plague in a cold stone cell. Margaret, just 13, was left to give birth alone in a remote Welsh castle. No husband, no power, no protection. The labor nearly killed her. Margaret survived, but her body was permanently damaged. She could never bear children again. The boy Henry Tudor was wrapped in linen, barely breathing, and handed to strangers, not in affection, but in desperation. From that moment on, a new question took shape. If Margaret could no longer be a mother in flesh, what kind of mother would she become? The answer, one forged in will, in silence, in terrifying patience. England, at the time, was not kind to women. They couldn't own land independently. They had no voice in law, no place in war. But Margaret learned how to play by men's rules, and more importantly, how to break them without being noticed. While the powerful cut each other down in battle, Margaret made herself invisible. She married again strategically, first to Henry Stafford, a nobleman who kept her politically safe by sitting on the fence between Lancaster and York. With him, she had the protection to quietly support her son even as he lived in exile across the sea. She sent letters. She moved money. She built networks of loyalty. Every move was a risk. Treason carried the death penalty. But she never hesitated. Not once. Because for Margaret there was no greater cause than the survival of her son. And as war continued to consume England, as kings rose and fell, she waited. She watched. She planned. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about a woman alone, underestimated, and nearly forgotten, who chose to outlast them all. Because Margaret Beaufort didn't need a crown. She only needed to be the mother of the man who wore it. Henry Tudor hadn't even learned to walk when blood was already being spilled in his name. The Wars of the Roses raged on. Only now they had taken new shapes. Allies became traitors. Nobles switched sides in the blink of an eye. Those who ruled in the morning often lost their heads by nightfall. The House of Lancaster was in retreat. And young Henry, bearing both Tudor and Beaufort blood, suddenly became one of the last viable heirs to the Lancastrian cause. Margaret Beaufort understood the stakes, and she made her first brutal, necessary decision. She let him go. At just 4 years old, Henry Tudor was sent into exile in Brittany, across the English Channel. Margaret didn't accompany him. She couldn't. Staying in England was dangerous, but abandoning it entirely meant surrendering any chance to influence power. So she made the most painful choice a mother can make. She stayed. He went. And from that moment on, they lived two separate lives bound by blood, divided by war. While Henry grew up as a political fugitive in foreign castles, constantly watched, occasionally hunted, Margaret re-entered the battlefield of politics not with a sword, but with strategy. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, provided her a layer of safety. He had connections to both houses and kept a cautious neutrality. Behind that shield, Margaret began to quietly build her web. She wasn't a queen. She had no army. But she had letters, gold patience, and the sharpest mind in the kingdom. When King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London in 1471, supposedly in his sleep, the Lancastrian line was considered extinct. But Margaret knew better. Her son, just 14 at the time, was the last living thread connecting Lancaster to legitimacy. That meant two things. He was now a beacon of hope, and a marked target. The Yorkist regime under Edward IV began diplomatic efforts to extradite Henry from France. Had they succeeded, he would have been executed without trial. But Margaret acted first. She negotiated, begged, and promised favors and payments to Breton nobles to protect her son. And they did. Henry lived, but he lived like a prisoner in exile. Back in England, Margaret prepared for war. Not one fought with swords, not yet, but one of loyalty, marriage, and allegiance. She remarried, this time to Thomas Stanley, one of the most politically influential men in the realm. Stanley was shrewd, pragmatic, and above all, a survivor. He never fully committed to one side, preferring to wait and bet on the winning horse. Margaret needed that. With Stanley's reach, Margaret began to move in silence. She rallied noble families disillusioned with Yorkist rule. She made contact with Yorkist defectors, promising that her son, raised abroad untouched by English factionalism, could offer a clean slate. A new king, a compromise. Her plan was long, dangerous, and it required one last astonishing step. She would unite the two warring houses. In 1483, tragedy and opportunity struck. King Edward IV died unexpectedly. His son, Edward V, was only 12 years old. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector. But within months, Richard seized the crown, declaring the princes illegitimate. He locked them in the Tower of London, and they were never seen again. England erupted in whispers. Did Richard kill his own nephews? Public sentiment shifted. Nobles turned. And Margaret saw her moment. She proposed a union no one could have imagined a decade earlier. Henry Tudor would marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, the same family that had once exiled and hunted her. This marriage would heal the kingdom, she said. End the wars. Unite the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into one. But make no mistake, this wasn't about love. It was about power, about finally putting her son on the throne. And so from exile, Henry prepared to return. Margaret sent him one final message. Now is the time. It was all or nothing. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed on English soil with a small army, and the weight of Margaret's entire life behind him. He marched inland. Waiting for him on the battlefield at Bosworth was Richard III, the reigning king, ruthless, battle-hardened, and surrounded by seasoned troops. Richard should have won. He had more men, more experience, and the crown already on his head. But he also had a problem. Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, had arrived with his own army, and no one knew which side he would join. At the last moment, Stanley made his move. He turned against Richard. The charge was brutal, the battle short. Richard III was unhorsed, surrounded, and slain in the mud. His crown was pulled from the battlefield and placed on Henry's head. The last Plantagenet king was dead, and Margaret, she stood apart from the battlefield. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She didn't rush to her son's side. She simply bowed her head and breathed for the first time in her life. She had won, but victory came with a cost. She wasn't just the mother of the king, she was the architect of a regime. And the enemies she had outlived weren't the only ghosts that would follow her. They called it a victory. But for Margaret Beaufort, it began like a funeral. Not because Richard III had died, not because blood was spilled on Bosworth's muddy field, but because the moment her son was crowned king, Margaret knew something she couldn't say out loud. She was the last one left. Those who had once mocked her, hunted her, stolen everything from her, now bowed before her, kissed the hem of her gown, whispered, "My lady, the king's mother," with trembling voices. But what they felt was not reverence, it was fear. And in Margaret's heart, it was not joy that stirred. It was emptiness. In 1485, Henry VII ascended the throne. He was 28. The boy born in terror and exile had become ruler of England. He owed everything to his mother, and he knew it. But even as he placed the crown upon his head, a quiet wedge began to form between them. Because Margaret Beaufort was not the kind of woman who stepped into the background. She didn't retire. She didn't fade. She had built this throne with blood and iron and silence. And now that her son sat on it, she could not let go. The court grew uneasy. Two queens walked the halls of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth of York, Henry's new wife, beautiful and beloved, and Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother, commanding, calculating, and ever-present. Elizabeth was supposed to be the face of the new era, the union of Lancaster and York. But in truth, the real power still pulsed through Margaret's steady, composed hands. She took her own chambers, her own servants, her own seal. In council meetings, she sat beside the king, not behind him. She signed orders in her name, presided over courts in his absence, and some whispered, controlled far more than she let on. And yet none of it made her happy, because the throne that she had built came with a cost no crown could measure. In 1502, tragedy struck with cruel precision. Henry, and Elizabeth's eldest son, Prince Arthur, died at just 15. He had been the future, the heir, the unifying symbol of peace after decades of war. He fell sick in Ludlow Castle, a high fever, days of agony, prayers offered, letters sent. By the time Margaret received the news, he was already gone. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She had learned long ago how to swallow sorrow. But something shifted inside her. Something broke that had not broken, even in childbirth, exile, or war. Arthur's death sent tremors through the court. Henry VII withdrew into himself. Elizabeth of York withered in grief. And Margaret began to vanish. Not physically. She was still there, walking the palace, attending mass, reviewing petitions. But her fire, that terrifying, calculating drive, began to cool. And then came the final blow. 1 year later, Elizabeth of York died in childbirth. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours. The Queen's death devastated the king. Henry, once the stubborn survivor of war, became a shell, distant, austere, haunted by shadows. Margaret was there at the funeral. She wore black. But again she did not weep, because grief had long ago taken from her the ability to mourn like others. She had survived too much, lost too much, and she knew even now the world would not let her rest. She turned inward, donated more money to Cambridge, commissioned chapels, funded scholarships. They called her a saint. They called her England's pious matriarch. But her prayers were not for the poor. They were for the dead, for the son she gave away, for the grandson she buried, for the daughter-in-law she never embraced, for the girl she used to be who never got to be a child. She grew frail, thin, quiet, but never irrelevant. Even in her final years, she acted as the kingdom's anchor. No major decision was made without her blessing. Even the marriage of her surviving grandson, Henry VIII, was orchestrated with her guiding hand. And then, in April 1509, King Henry VII died. He had ruled for 24 years, united a kingdom, founded a dynasty. But when he closed his eyes for the last time, Margaret was the last person he saw. She sat beside him, held his hand, whispered prayers. Her only son, her only child. The boy, born from blood and pain, now returned to dust. 3 months later, Margaret Beaufort followed him. There was no dramatic deathbed scene, no gasping confession. She simply faded. Her last words were never recorded, but her closest attendant said this. She closed her eyes, clutched her crucifix, and whispered, "For my son." She died just 1 day after her grandson, Henry VIII, turned 18, old enough to rule on his own. As if she had held on just long enough, and then let go. Her funeral was quiet but dignified, held at Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens are buried. On her tomb, no crown, no grand declaration. Only this Margaret, mother of Henry VII, King of England. A title earned not by birth, but by war, by strategy, by sacrifice. She had no throne, yet kings knelt where she stood. She had no army, yet dynasties rose at her command. She had no voice in Parliament, yet her name echoed through every hall of power. Margaret Beaufort didn't just survive history, she rewrote it in blood, in silence, and in shadow. History doesn't say much about her. In official records, Margaret Beaufort is often just a footnote mother of Henry VII. A name squeezed between wars, treaties, and royal births. A silent figure standing just outside the spotlight. But if you stop, if you pause long enough to listen to the gaps between the lines, you'll begin to realize something profound. The most powerful forces in history are often the quietest. Margaret didn't leave behind golden statues or epic speeches. She left behind institutions, alliances, ideas, legacies written in stone and blood, not parchment. She was the architect of the Tudor dynasty, though she never wore a crown. Without her, there would have been no Henry VII, no Elizabeth I, no Golden Age. She didn't just give birth to a king, she carved out the very path that put him on the throne. And yet, even as the Tudor name became immortal, hers began to fade. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, yes, but no royal procession carried her crown. No national mourning was declared. Her tomb bears no title of queen, no exaltation of her influence. Just a plain, cold inscription, Margaret, mother of Henry VII. That was the box history put her in. But the truth, she redefined what it meant to be a mother and what it meant to rule without ruling. She never led armies, but she commanded generals. She never passed laws, but she orchestrated kings. She never sat on a throne, but every decision that passed through it had her fingerprint. She founded Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, both still standing today. She poured money into education not as charity, but as vision. In an age where most women were denied the right to learn, she ensured that thousands would, men and women alike, long after she was gone. Some call her saintly. Others call her ruthless. The truth lies somewhere between. Because Margaret Beaufort was a paradox, a devout Catholic who funded cathedrals and plotted rebellions, a woman of faith who wielded secrets like weapons, a mother who gave everything for her son and lost nearly everything else. And in that contradiction we find the heart of her legacy. She didn't just change England. She forced it to reckon with a new kind of power, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't fight, doesn't rule from the throne, but from the shadows. After her death, her dynasty rose to its peak, and then began to rot from within. Henry VIII, her grandson, tore the country apart with his need for heirs. He executed wives, burned monasteries, split the church, all in search of the same thing Margaret had secured through silence legacy. And yet, even as the Tudors consumed themselves, the world Margaret built endured. To this day, you can walk the halls she founded, read the laws her son passed, hear echoes of her strategy in every modern state built on alliance and diplomacy, rather than brute force. She may have died in silence, but her silence was not surrender. It was calculation. It was power, wielded without armor. And it leaves us with one haunting question. If a woman who was never queen could shape the fate of an entire empire, then how many others did we never see coming? She never led a battle. She never wore a crown. And yet, England bent to her will. Margaret Beaufort didn't need the title of queen to rule. She mastered the art of survival in a kingdom built to silence women. Her legacy was not carved in gold. It was written in bloodlines, alliances, and the silence between power and obedience. But hers is not the only story buried beneath the throne. Because if you thought Margaret's life was brutal, wait until you meet her granddaughter-in-law, Anne Boleyn, a queen who rose just as high and fell twice as hard. Ambition, seduction, betrayal, and a death that still echoes through British history. Click here to uncover the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn and the love that became a death sentence. And if these stories of power, sacrifice, and hidden women in history move you, subscribe, because what comes next is even darker.